Hello everyone, welcome to this tutorial. My name is Dennis and let's take a look at our project for today. So we're going to be recreating this 3D title animation that I made, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to first build the 3D text in Cinema 4D with Octane. We're then going to import that into After Effects and composite it onto this 3D digital floor that we're going to build inside of After Effects. So it's pretty straightforward, and let's just jump right into it. Okay, here we are in Cinema, and the first thing you want to do is to create a text object, and go ahead and type in our titles, and let's make that center aligned and pick our font. So the font that I'm using is TR2M. It's a free font. You can find that on the web. So just type in TR2M font, and it should be one of the top 2 results. So go ahead, download it, install it, and it should be good. So with our text object, let's drop that into a extrude object and increase the depth here. And let's duplicate it, bring it back, and maybe drop that down a little bit. And under caps, let's change that to fillet cap, and we can play with the type here. So I'm going to change that to 1 step. Let's bring that in, and maybe make it a little thinner. Let's see, something like that. Maybe make this one not so thick. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. Now let's take our text object and duplicate it one more time and bring it out in front. And let's go ahead and create a rectangle and a sweep nerd. For our rectangle, let's change the width and height to something like 1 by 1. Let's drop that into the sweep with the text, and we get this. And let's move that back. So let's look from the top. Something like this. Cool. Let's go ahead and create a plane. This is going to be our floor. Scale it up. Let's rename it our floor. And let's go down here and maybe drop that down just below. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and create a camera and look through it. And the way I usually like to set up my camera is, first of all, let's change that to 50 for the focal length. And let me zero out all my position and rotation, so it's right at the origin. I'm going to hit Alt-G on my keyboard to group it into a null object, and I'm going to just bring back my camera on the Z, something like that. Now I can play with the rotation of the null, and let's just go ahead and center our camera. So maybe I can bring it up somewhat and maybe not so steep. Let's say maybe something like this. And we want to keyframe the H rotation. So before I do that though, I'm going to hit Control D on my keyboard to bring out my project settings and go over to the key interpolation tab. And under interpolation, by default it's set to spline. I'm going to change that to linear, so that whenever I keyframe anything, it's just going to be a linear keyframe. So let's, right now we're working at 24 frames per second. So let's do, say, 5 seconds. So 24 times 5, 120 frames. And at the frame 0, let's go somewhere here. Go to the end. Let's make a slide rotation, something like that. Let's bring that back. Let's play it through. It's not bad. Let me bring the null back a little bit, maybe up. back. Let's play that again. I'm just trying to center this in the screen. So let's see. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and turn off my display grid just so I can see things a little easier. Maybe I do a little more. And let me scale up my floor a little bit more. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So, like I said, I'm going to be using Octane to texture this. And whenever I use Octane, I have a custom layout that I'm going to load up. Let's see. Just let it load. There we go. And let's go ahead and just look at some of the render settings. I'm going to be using direct lighting for this because it's a very simple scene. And normally I just leave everything pretty much as default. The only thing I want to change is the specular depth. I usually put that to 10, and for these guys maybe like 5 or 6. So let's just put 6, 6, 6. And I will also check static noise. I usually do that whenever I do animations. And then adaptive sampling. And this usually speed up my renders as well. And everything else, I should just leave it the same. And maybe for the priority, I'll change that to medium for now. And whenever I render, I set it back to high. Okay, so let's just send that to Octane, and this is what this looks like by default, which is pretty nice as it is. And for my resolution, let me just work at 1280 by 720, and I will lock my resolution here so I see exactly how much what this is. Okay, so let's start making some materials. So the first thing I want to do is to create an environment, and you can add a HDR to this, but I think I'm just going to use a RGB spectrum, which is just a color. And let me bring that to 0 to create a black environment. Then I'm going to create a area light, and like the camera, I'm going to group it into a null and just move it back in the Z, something like this, and maybe scale it up as well. And I'm going to play with the rotation of the null object and position the light maybe in the upper left corner, something like that. And then maybe turn down the intensity or power of the light. And I think we're let's see. I think we're good for now. Let's swing back to this and make adjustments later if we need to. So let's make a material for the floor. To do that, I'm going to use a Octane glossy material, and just going to bring the color to black and just apply it to the floor. And let's rename our material as our floor. And maybe let's turn up the roughness a little bit, and we can even tune down the specular a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll bring the floor up just a little bit so it's intersecting. Cool. Now let's make the light rim. So to do that, I'm going to create a diffuse material, and under emissions, let's add a black body emission, and I'm going to check surface brightness. I think this helps with the accuracy. It scales the intensity based on the size of your object. So let's apply that to, let's see, our our sweep. Boom, there it is. Let's go ahead and make the transparent material now. Let's create, so we're going to use a specular material, and let's just apply that to these guys and see what that looks like. And right now it doesn't look like much, but if we go into the material and crank up the roughness a little bit, and let's check fake shadows, and let's bump up the index something like 2, and let's change the color for the transmission, make it something like a little light blue, and I think that looks pretty good. Okay, cool. At this point, I think we got everything set up, but let's just tweak and fine-tune everything a little bit. So for my light, I think the position is pretty good. We can play with the temperature of the light. So if you move it to the right, it's going to be more cool, and then if you move it to the left, it's going to be warmer light. So I'm going to keep the whole thing more of a coolish tone, something like that. Let me go into my emission material, and I'm going to change the temperature as well. Maybe I will check the double-sided option, maybe turn it down, something like that. Cool. At this point, let me add a Octane camera tag to my camera, and I'm going to enable camera imager. And here you have a option of all these color curves that you can kind of like play with, that will give you some cool looks. But I typically like to just keep it linear and bring the camera back up, because I usually like to do all my color correction in post and After Effects. I just find it to be easier. And let's go ahead and enable our AI denoiser. That will significantly speed up our renders. So let's take a look. So this is the denoise path, and this is our main path. Amazing. So let's see. Let me bring my light up a little more overhead, something like that. Cool, cool. So I think we're pretty much good to go. So let's just go ahead and render out the sequence. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my render settings. Let's switch this back to high. And for my samples, for max samples, maybe I'll just use, let's say, 150. I think that should be good. And let's go into my render settings and set the output to all frames, and pick a folder to save it as. So I'm going to call this Legacy Beauty 2, and let's enable Octane render. And the important thing here is just to check the denoise, use denoise path right here. So I think we got everything set up, and I'm just going to render to picture viewer and let it render. And as you can see, it's fairly fast. It's about 10 seconds per frame. So I'm going to let this render and pause this, and I'll see you when this is done. Okay, we're back, and let's take a look at our rendered sequence. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. But before we bring this into After Effects, there are just a couple more things we want to do. I want to create a mat for the floor so that in After Effects I can separate out the title from the reflections. And also I want to export the camera data from Cinema 4D into After Effects so that I can composite everything correctly. So let's go ahead and do that. And to do that, I'm going to actually use the standard Cinema 4D render engine because I find that to be just a little bit easier and faster. And let me go ahead and turn my layout back to the startup layout. And let me add a Cinema 4D compositing tag to the floor and enable object buffer 1. And let's enable multipass and object buffer 1. And let me just do a quick render test. Render to picture viewer, and under layers single pass you can take a look at what the object buffer looks like. And you know what, I'm gonna duplicate the floor real quick, move it back in space, and turn it in the Y direction so that we have an actual background. So if we render that again, so it's gonna be white and black. So that's exactly what we want. I'm also going to add a external compositing tag to the floor so that when we import the data into After Effects, this comes in as a null object. So let's go ahead and render out the object buffer. So let's go select all frames, save, and we just need to save the multipass. Let's use a JPEG for this, and let me name this my floor mat 2. Alright, and let's hit render, and this should be fairly fast, so that's good. So to export the camera data while that's rendering, you want to go under your Save tab, under here, Compositing Project File, and I'm going to check these boxes, and I'm just going to save project file, and it's going to create a AEC file. And let's take a look at our progress, and it's done. So now let's go back into After Effects, and I'm going to import that AEC file that I just made. And what that's going to do is going to import all my camera data and the passes, the render passes I just created. So let's open up this comp, and if we bring our object buffer, everything should track pretty perfectly. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and import our beauty pass that we just rendered, and let's take a look at that. And again, everything is tracking perfectly, so I think we're good to go. And so let's start building our digital floor. But before that, let me rename this as my render layer, and this is as my comp, just for organization. And I'm going to rename this as my main comp. Spell that correctly, main comp. Okay, and I'm going to save that as my legacy tutorial. Okay, cool. So to build this digital floor, let me create a brand new comp. Let's make that 2000 by 2000. I'm gonna call this my digital floor. Okay. And let me create a black solid and apply the fractal noise effect. Okay, good old fractal noise. I am going to change the type to block and bring down the complexity, something like this. And let me increase the contrast and tune down the brightness, something like that. Okay. And let me keyframe or add an expression to the evolution. So I'm going to alt click and times 200. Cool. And let me add a exposure effects to this as well. And crank this up. So it's really just a balance between contrast, brightness, and the exposure effect. So if I bring down the contrast more, I can crush everything, and so I think that's pretty good. Maybe even a little smaller. Okay, cool. Let me duplicate this layer. Oh, actually, I'm going to be working in 32-bit for my project, because we're going to want to do some nice glows later on. And I'm going to clip the overflow, switch the overflow to clip. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and let me screen this, and let's go into evolutions and just change the random seed a little bit. And maybe I want to scale it down, something like that. Okay, let's duplicate that again, and once again change the random seed, and maybe I scale it back up a little bit. So the idea is just to duplicate this several times to create different levels of detail. And if I crank up the brightness, crush it down, turn down the complexity. Okay, cool. Let me duplicate this one more time, and let's turn up the scale much bigger. Turn up the brightness, turn up the complexity, decrease the contrast, and okay, cool. Maybe scale this even up more. Cool, let's duplicate that one more time, and again offset the random seed. And let's create some really big ones. And maybe I'm gonna uncheck uniform scaling and make some different looking shapes like this. Okay. Okay, cool. Duplicate that one more time, and let's make some really big ones. So if I just solo this layer real quick and bring back the brightness, crank up the complexity, decrease the contrast, just play with these options, and maybe I can tune down the opacity as well. See. maybe I turn down the opacity of this layer as well. And one more time for this big one right here. Just go to evolutions, change the seed. Play with these guys a little bit. I am actually going to add a effect called find edges. This is a really cool effect. If I invert that, you get these little lines. So if I put this back, turn up the cool. So pretty much that's the idea. We just want to keep building. You can add more details if you like, but I think I'm cool with that for now. You know what? Maybe I just add a little bit more of these guys. So let's see. Or maybe I can add one more of these guys as well. Random seed and transform for this one. Let's bring this a little smaller. Something like that. And now let's bring this back up. And another thing you can do is, if you go into expression, you can just change the number here. Just every other one, you can vary it up just to give it a little more variety. Yeah. Some are a little slower, some are faster. So you know. So I think we're pretty good. Okay, let's go into our main comp. And we have a light here that we imported. We don't need that. Let's delete it. And the first thing we want to do is let's separate out the floor from the text. So to do that, I'm going to use an effect called set matte. I'm going to select the object buffer layer and use luminance. So if I solo that layer, we have just cut out the floor like so. Let's duplicate this and invert matte. So now we have our object back. So now we have the 3D text by itself and the floor. Okay, now let's drop the digital floor we just built in between these guys. And let's turn that into a 3D layer. And I'm going to open up the position and rotation of the null. I'm going to hide it because I don't need to see it. And I'm just going to copy the position and rotation. I don't need the keyframes as well. So select all of it, copy, paste. But I need to rotate this in the X, say by 90 degrees. Okay. So now it should track with my layer and camera, and I can scale this down, something like that, and change the blending mode to say screen. And I'm also going to add a black solid in the background in the very bottom, like so. So I can duplicate this layer and rotate it in a Z by 90 degrees. I can scale this one up and maybe turn down the opacity. I can also turn down the opacity of this one as well. So you just want something kind of subtle that's like happening. Maybe I want to scale this up so that it's not cutting off. Another thing you can do is I'm going to duplicate this digital floor layer. I'm going to call this my grid. let's go in here and I'm going to select all these layers and delete it and create a brand new solid, and I'm just going to apply a grid effect. Let's change that to width and slider. I'm going to change the border to something like 2 and make it a little bigger, something like that. Let's go back to our main comp. Let's duplicate one of the floors here. Turn back the opacity for now and just replace it with the grid that we have. Okay, let's scale that up and turn down the opacity to something like 10. Yeah, maybe 5. Something very subtle. So now we have this cool digital floor, and another thing I would like to do before, well, let's do some color correction first. So let's add an adjustment layer above all of these guys, but below the our text layer. Let me call this my color correction. And let me add a curves to this, and maybe I can just crush everything down. Add a little contrast curve here. And let me add a little blue to the color and maybe bring down the red just a little bit. And for my text layer, let me add a curves as well. Add a little contrast curve. Oops. Something like that. And maybe just boost up the blue a tiny bit. I think that looks pretty good. I am going to add a black solid above my grid. Let's go into our mask tool, use the Eclipse tool, and just double click. We're going to create a circular mask. I'm going to subtract it and feather it out. So I'm just creating a little vignette, and maybe just bring that down, opacity a little bit. Maybe I extend that, something like that. Okay, cool. So at this point, let me go create a overall adjustment layer, and let me add a glow effect. Ooh. So let's crank up the radius a little bit, and maybe let's bring down the intensity, and we can play with the threshold here as well. Let's bring that back up. We can duplicate this glow one more time and make the radius much bigger, and play with the intensity and the threshold. Okay, cool. I think that looks great. So at this point, it's kind of like you kind of just like, you know, experiment and see what's cool. This is kind of like the fun part, you know. So maybe for my floor, maybe I can add a glow to that as well, if I want to just highlight some of the stuff. But yeah, I think that looks really cool. Let me run preview this and see how it looks, and I'll pause this as a rem previews. Okay, we're back, and this is our rem previewed animation, and I think that looks really nice. Just a couple more things we can do just to maybe make this even a little nicer. Maybe if I add another black solid, so if I hide my text object, if I add another black solid down here, I can just do another mask so that, oops, a little rectangular mask here, and again let's change that to subtract, and let me just feather out the Y just so that it kind of fades into black in the back so that you don't see a hard edge, and maybe something like that. Yeah, pretty much it. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoy this. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time.